I stood alone in that bridal suite for 43 minutes wearing a $3,000 dress, listening to my wedding march playing without me. And when that door finally opened, a stranger whispered my name like she was delivering news of my own death. My name is Emma Richardson, and this is the story of how I was erased from my own wedding by the people I loved most in this world. I was 28 years old, a wedding planner. Can you imagine the irony? I'd orchestrated over 200 perfect days for other brides, and when it came to mine, I didn't see what was happening right in front of my eyes. David Montgomery was everything I thought I wanted. CEO of a tech startup, old Charleston money. The kind of smile that made you forget to ask the right questions. We'd been together for 2 years and engaged for 8 months, and every single day of that engagement, I ignored the signs because I was too busy being in love with the idea of being loved. The morning started perfectly. My bridesmaids arrived at 7 with champagne and those little cucumber sandwiches nobody actually eats. We laughed. We took photos. My makeup artist made me look like someone worthy of being remembered. The dress fit like it was grown from my skin. Everything was exactly as I'd planned it, down to the white roses and the string quartet warming up 2 floors below. Then Madison Pierce, my best friend for 3 years, the woman who'd held my hand through every wedding decision, kissed my cheek and said she needed to check on something downstairs. Just 5 minutes, she promised. The other bridesmaids followed her out, giggling about last-minute details. The door closed. I was alone with my reflection and my heartbeat and the sound of guests arriving in the garden below. 5 minutes became 10. Then 20. I texted. No response. I called. Straight to voicemail. Then I heard it. The string quartet beginning the processional. My processional. The music I'd chosen 6 months ago. But nobody had come to get me. Nobody had knocked on the door. I stood there in that room with my bouquet trembling in my hands, wondering if this was some kind of surprise or joke or test that I didn't understand. And that's when the fear started crawling up my spine, because something was very, very wrong. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about trust and betrayal. The music continued drifting up through the floorboards, and I could hear the officiant's voice beginning the ceremony, and my legs almost gave out, because how could they start without me, unless they weren't starting without me, unless something else entirely was happening down there. I reached for the door handle, and that's when it opened from the outside, and a woman I'd never seen before stepped into the room. She was maybe 55 with gray hair pulled back tight, and she wore a catering company uniform, but her eyes had this intensity that made my stomach drop. She said my full name, Emma Richardson, like it was a question and an accusation at the same time. I nodded because I couldn't speak, and she pulled out her phone and said, "You need to see this before you go down there." And I thought she was going to show me some problem with the cake or the flowers, but instead she turned the screen toward me, and I saw a live video feed of my ceremony. My ceremony. With my decorations and my music and my guests, and David standing at the altar in his custom gray suit, looking more handsome than I'd ever seen him. And there was a bride walking down the aisle in a dress almost identical to mine. And when she got closer, I saw her face and the floor disappeared beneath me. Madison Pierce. My best friend Madison was walking down the aisle toward my fiancé at my wedding, wearing my veil, carrying white roses, exactly like the ones in my bouquet that was still trembling in my frozen hands. The woman holding the phone caught my elbow as I staggered backward, and she whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but you need to keep watching." And I did, because I couldn't look away, even though every second felt like glass sliding under my skin. David took Madison's hands. He was smiling. Not nervous. Not confused. Smiling like this was exactly what was supposed to happen. The officiant began speaking about love and commitment and sacred bonds, and I watched my mother in the front row crying tears of joy, and David's parents beaming with pride, and all 200 guests sitting there witnessing this like it was beautiful and real and right. I heard myself say, "That's my wedding," and the woman nodded and said, "Yes, it is," and I said, "But I'm here, I'm right here," and she said, "I know, and that's the problem." My brain couldn't process it. Madison was my friend, my best friend. She'd helped me pick out that dress. She'd been at every fitting, every tasting, every decision. She'd held me when I cried about cold feet last month and told me David was the one. And now she was standing in my place speaking vows that sounded exactly like the ones I'd written, the ones I'd shared with her over wine 3 weeks ago. The woman's phone showed everything in horrible crystal clarity. Madison's hand sliding the ring onto David's finger. David's hand sliding a ring onto hers. A ring I recognized. My ring. The one we'd chosen together at that little antique shop in Savannah. The guests started applauding, and David pulled Madison close and kissed her, and the camera shook slightly like whoever was filming was trying to stay hidden, and I realized this woman, this stranger, had someone down there documenting my erasure in real time. I looked at her and tried to form words, but all that came out was how, and she said, "There's so much you don't know, Emma, and we don't have much time, and I need you to trust me right now, because if you go down there and make a scene, you'll lose everything. But if you come with me, if you let me show you what's really happening, we might be able to stop this." "Stop what?" I whispered, and she said, "The theft," and I said, "They're stealing my wedding," and she looked at me with something like pity and said, "No, Emma, they're stealing something much bigger than that." The music swelled into the recessional, and through the phone, I watched David and Madison walk back down the aisle as husband and wife, with everyone cheering and throwing rose petals, and my mother hugging Madison like she was her daughter. And I felt something inside me crack so deeply I thought I might actually shatter right there on the floor. The woman whose name I still didn't know grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the back staircase, the one the staff used, and as we descended, I could hear the cocktail hour beginning with champagne corks popping and laughter echoing through the halls, and every sound felt like a knife. She moved fast, and I stumbled after her in my heels and heavy dress, and when we reached the ground floor, she pulled me into a service corridor and held a finger to her lips, and then slowly opened a door that led directly into the reception garden. We were hidden behind a massive flower arrangement, but I could see everything. David and Madison standing by the champagne fountain greeting guests. My Aunt Eleanor kissing Madison's cheek. My college roommate taking selfies with the happy couple. The wedding party posing for photos that should have had me in the center. I watched Madison throw her head back, laughing at something David whispered in her ear, and he looked at her the way he used to look at me in the beginning, before things got complicated, before he started working late and canceling plans and being just distant enough that I convinced myself I was imagining it. The woman next to me whispered her name was Clara, and she'd been hired 3 months ago to work this wedding, but not in the way I thought, and before she could explain my bridesmaid, Jessica walked past us close enough that I could smell her perfume, and she was telling someone on the phone that everything went perfectly, thank God. Emma never suspected anything. My knees buckled. Clara caught me and dragged me back through the service door, and we ran through the kitchen where actual catering staff looked at us confused, and out the back exit to a white van parked behind the building. She shoved me into the passenger seat and drove away fast, and I twisted around to look back at the venue where my wedding reception was happening without me, where everyone I loved was celebrating my replacement, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't understand how this was real. Clara drove in silence for 10 minutes before pulling into a parking garage and turning off the engine, and finally looking at me with tears in her eyes. She said, "I need to tell you everything, Emma, but first I need you to know that your grandmother suspected this might happen, and that's why she hired me 6 months before she died. My grandmother had been gone for 8 months. She'd never even met David. How could she have known anything?" Clara opened a folder from the back seat and spread documents across the dashboard, and I saw photos of David and Madison together at a restaurant dated 14 months ago, 2 months before David and I supposedly met by chance at a coffee shop. There were bank statements, text messages, email printouts, a contract with a wedding planner that wasn't me. Clara said your grandmother was sick, but she wasn't stupid. And when you told her about David, she hired me to investigate him, because something felt wrong to her, and what I found was bigger than just an affair. Emma, this was a plan, and it's been in motion for almost 2 years. I stared at the evidence, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't hold the paper steady. Clara continued talking about my grandmother's estate, about money I didn't even know existed, about a trust fund worth millions that would only transfer to me upon marriage, and suddenly pieces started clicking together in my mind. David's sudden interest in me. Madison's friendship that began exactly 2 months after David and I started dating. The way David pushed for a quick engagement. Madison's insistence on being involved in every wedding detail. The prenup David's lawyer drew up that I'd signed without reading, because I trusted him, because I loved him, because I thought that's what you did when you were building a life with someone. Clara pulled out her phone again and showed me a video she'd recorded earlier of Madison in the bridal suite before I arrived, practicing walking in heels and adjusting a veil, and she was wearing my dress, or one exactly like it, and she kept saying, "I can do this, like she was preparing for a performance. The video was time-stamped from this morning while I was at the hair salon. They'd planned everything, the switch, the timing. They'd even made sure I'd be isolated upstairs while Madison took my place downstairs. Clara said they needed you legally out of the picture for 48 hours, and by then the marriage certificate would be filed, and the trust fund would transfer, and they'd disappear before you could contest anything." I felt vomit rising in my throat. Everything I'd believed about my life for the past 2 years was a construction, a lie so elaborate that dozens of people had to be involved. How many of those guests knew? How many of my friends and family had been paid off or convinced or manipulated into participating in my erasure? Clara reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "We have 48 hours. Emma, 48 hours before that marriage becomes legal, and the money moves. And I know you're destroyed right now. But I need to know, are you going to fall apart? Or are you going to fight because your grandmother left instructions for this exact scenario? And if you're willing to trust me, we can stop them. But it requires something from you that you might not be ready to give." What would you do in Emma's position? Would you fight back or walk away? Tell me in the comments, because what Clara asks of her next changes everything. Clara drove me to a small apartment across town, and when we walked inside, I saw that she'd transformed it into an investigation headquarters with photos and documents covering an entire wall connected by red string like something from a crime thriller. She made me tea I couldn't drink and sat me down and started from the beginning. My grandmother, Eleanor Richardson, had been a sharp woman even at 83 when the cancer diagnosis came, and when I'd introduced David to her at a family dinner, she'd smiled politely, but later told my mother something was off about him, something performative and fake. My mother had dismissed it as old age and paranoia, but my grandmother had money and resources and stubborn instinct, so she'd hired Clara, who wasn't just catering staff, but a private investigator specializing in financial fraud. Clara had spent 6 months building a case. David Montgomery wasn't even his real name. He was David Mills from a middle-class family in Ohio, and the tech startup was real but failing, and he had gambling debts that totaled over $200,000. Madison Pierce was his girlfriend of 5 years, and they'd worked together on this con targeting vulnerable, wealthy women, and I was the third one. The first two had figured it out before marriage and settled quietly to avoid embarrassment. But my grandmother's trust fund was bigger than anything they'd attempted before $4.2 million that would unlock the moment I signed a marriage certificate. Clara showed me the entire paper trail. David had researched my family, found out about the trust through public records. and engineered our meeting at that coffee shop where he'd spilled coffee on my laptop and insisted on buying me a new one and asking me to dinner to make up for it. Every moment of our relationship had been calculated. Madison had been inserted into my life through a mutual friend who was also being paid 3 months after David and I started dating, so she could monitor me, report back, and eventually take my place. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. They'd spent months making sure I trusted them completely. David proposed on my birthday in front of my whole family, so I'd be too emotional to question anything. Madison helped me plan the wedding so she'd know every detail and could replicate it. They'd even hired actresses to play my bridesmaids, women I thought were friends, but who disappeared from my life with cash payments the moment they left me alone in that bridal suite. My real friends had been systematically excluded from the wedding party with excuses about limited space and family obligations. Clara pulled out more documents showing how they'd been forging my signatures for weeks, creating a fake identity for Madison that matched my legal name close enough to fool banks and lawyers in the chaos of a wedding. The marriage certificate they'd file would list Madison as Emma Richardson with my birth date and social security number, and by the time I discovered the fraud, the trust fund money would be transferred to accounts in the Cayman Islands and they'd vanish. Even the venue had been paid in cash through a shell company, so there'd be no trail back to David's real identity. My mother's involvement was the part that hurt most. Clara showed me bank records proving she'd received $50,000 3 weeks ago. My mother, who'd always struggled with money, who I'd helped support for years, had sold me out. She'd known Madison would be the bride. She'd known I'd be abandoned upstairs. She'd cried at the ceremony not from joy, but from guilt she'd chosen to suppress for cash. I sat there surrounded by evidence of my own destruction and felt something cold and hard crystallizing in my chest where my heart used to be. Clara said your grandmother anticipated all of this, Emma, and she left very specific instructions in her will that only I was authorized to access, and she essentially gave you an out. If I could prove David was defrauding you, the trust fund would bypass the marriage requirement entirely and transfer directly to you. But there was a catch. I had to publicly expose them. I had to make sure David and Madison faced legal consequences. My grandmother had been adamant that women like me needed to stop protecting our abusers out of shame or fear. She wanted me to stand up, to be loud, to make sure they couldn't do this to anyone else. Clara looked at me with surprising gentleness and said, I know you're heartbroken and humiliated and probably want to disappear, but your grandmother believed you were stronger than that, and she left you the tools to destroy them if you're brave enough to use them. I thought about Madison wearing my veil, David kissing her with my ring on his finger, my mother's tears that meant nothing, all those guests celebrating a lie. Something shifted inside me, something sharp and focused. I looked at Clara and asked, what do we do? And she smiled for the first time since I'd met her. She said, we give them exactly what they want. We let them think they've won, and then in 48 hours when they're celebrating on their honeymoon in Key West, using your trust fund money, we show up with lawyers and police and cameras, and we burn their entire operation to the ground. The next 48 hours were the longest of my life, but Clara moved with military precision, and I followed her lead because the alternative was collapsing, and I'd done enough of that already. She'd been documenting everything for months and had connections with federal investigators who specialized in identity fraud and financial crimes. We filed reports. We gave statements. We handed over every text message, email, and photo that proved David and Madison's conspiracy. The investigators moved fast because the crime was actively in progress and the money hadn't transferred yet. On the second day, Clara and I flew to Key West with 2 FBI agents and a lawyer my grandmother had retained years ago, who'd been waiting for this exact situation. We found David and Madison at a luxury resort, drinking Mai Tais by the pool, wearing matching sunglasses and looking so satisfied with themselves it made my stomach turn. The agents approached them first, and I watched from a distance as confusion, then panic crossed their faces. Madison tried to run and got about 10 feet before hotel security stopped her. David tried to talk his way out of it, charm and smile and explain like he'd explained away every red flag I'd ignored. But the agents weren't 28-year-old women in love, they were professionals with evidence and warrants. I walked up while they were being handcuffed and David saw me and the color drained from his face. He said Emma in this broken voice like I was the one who'd done something wrong, and I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing. Madison started screaming that I'd ruined everything, that I was supposed to just disappear, that I was too stupid to matter anyway. And that's when I realized she'd always hated me, that every moment of our friendship had been poisoned by resentment and jealousy, and the kind of emptiness that makes people into monsters. The agents took them away, and other officers were simultaneously arresting my mother and the fake bridesmaids and the forger who'd created Madison's false documents. The whole network collapsed in a single coordinated strike. Clara stood next to me, watching it all unfold, and I turned to her and asked, "Why did you help me? You could have just done your job, reported to my grandmother's estate, and walked away." She looked at me with tears streaming down her face and said, "Because 30 years ago I was you, Emma. I was erased from my own wedding, by a man I loved, and a family that chose money over me, and I lost everything, and I never recovered financially or emotionally. And when your grandmother hired me and I saw what was happening to you, I couldn't let history repeat itself. I couldn't let another woman be destroyed by people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to wealth." We stood there crying together, two women connected by betrayal and survival, and something clicked in my mind. I asked Clara what happened to her after her wedding, and she said she'd spent decades working odd jobs, investigating small cases, never quite finding solid ground again. The next day, after the trust fund officially transferred to me after the marriage certificate David and Madison filed was voided after my mother was arrested for conspiracy to commit fraud, I sat down with Clara and the lawyer and made a decision. I split the inheritance. $2.1 million for me, $2.1 million for Clara. She tried to refuse, said it was my grandmother's money, my birthright, but I told her my grandmother would have approved because she believed in protecting women, and Clara had protected me when no one else would. 6 months later, Clara and I opened a non-profit organization called Second Chance Ceremonies. We help victims of wedding fraud, romantic scams, and financial abuse perpetrated by intimate partners. We provide legal support, investigative resources, and most importantly, we tell them they're not stupid, they're not alone, and they deserve to fight back. My mother sent letters from jail begging for forgiveness, and eventually I wrote back, not because I forgave her, but because holding on to that hate was destroying me more than it was hurting her. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It means releasing the poison so it stops killing you from the inside. David and Madison are serving 5 and 7 years respectively for identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy. The fake bridesmaids got probation. The forger got 3 years. None of it gives me back the 2 years I lost, or the innocence I had before I learned that love could be a weapon, but it gives other women a chance to not go through what I did. I never had a real wedding, and honestly, I'm not sure I want one anymore. Marriage feels different now, less like a fairy tale, and more like a legal contract that requires extreme vetting. But I did have a ceremony of my own 6 months after everything fell apart. Just me and Clara and a few real friends I'd reconnected with standing on a beach at sunset, and I read vows to myself. Vows about trusting my instincts, about never shrinking myself to fit someone else's plan, about believing that I'm worth more than what I can provide to someone else. I was forgotten at my own wedding, but in being forgotten, I found my voice and my strength and a sister in Clara who saved me when the world tried to erase me. The door opened that day and someone said my name, and it wasn't the beginning of my wedding. It was the beginning of my actual life, the one I was always meant to live on my own terms. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely? Have you ever had to choose between staying silent or fighting back even when it terrified you? Or maybe you know someone who went through something similar and never got to tell their story. Share your experience in the comments below, or if you want me to tell your story on this channel, reach out, because every story of survival deserves to be heard, and every person who fights back deserves to know they're not alone. Your story could be the one that saves someone else.